On a cold Tuesday morning in Chicago, a 58-year-old grandmother named Grace Williams walked up to a stranger in her diner, placed a folded piece of paper next to his coffee cup, and whispered 4 words that would destroy a $3.2 billion empire. The man sitting at that table wasn't just any customer. He was Theodore Blackwood, the billionaire CEO who owned the restaurant where Grace had worked double shifts for 8 years, desperately trying to pay for her daughter's life-saving medical treatment. What Theodore didn't know was that Grace had spent 3 years secretly documenting how his corporate policies were systematically killing his own employees. 12 people had already died. Grace was about to become number 13. But first, she was going to make sure the most powerful man in the food industry knew exactly what his pursuit of profit was costing in human lives. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Theodore Samuel Blackwood didn't start as a billionaire. Born in 1962 in Gary, Indiana, to a steelworker father and a school cafeteria cook mother, Theodore learned early that success meant outworking everyone around you. His mother, Dorothy, would work 12-hour days feeding other people's children while barely having enough to feed her own. His father, Samuel, came home every night with steel dust in his lungs and pride in his voice, talking about the bridges and buildings he'd helped create. At that modest dinner table in Gary, young Theodore learned that honest work was sacred, that treating people with dignity mattered more than profit, and that success meant lifting up your community, not stepping on it. These values would guide him for the first half of his life, but would be completely abandoned in the second half, with devastating consequences for thousands of families across America. At 23, Theodore opened his first restaurant with a $15,000 loan from his grandmother, Ella Mae Blackwood. Blackwood's family diner was a simple place where steelworkers could get a hot meal and feel at home. Ella Mae had worked as a domestic worker for 40 years, cleaning wealthy families' homes while raising 5 children of her own. That $15,000 represented her entire life savings, money she'd earned $1 at a time, scrubbing floors and washing dishes for people who barely acknowledged her existence. She gave it to Theodore with one condition that would haunt him decades later. Promise me you'll never forget that every person who walks through your door is somebody's child, somebody's parent, somebody's hope for a better tomorrow. Theodore hugged his grandmother that day and swore he would honor her values forever. But somewhere between that first diner and his 847th location, something fundamental changed in Theodore Blackwood's soul. The transformation wasn't sudden. It happened gradually, decision by decision, compromise by compromise. The young man who once knew every customer's name became the CEO who hadn't set foot in an actual restaurant in over 3 years. The entrepreneur who personally served coffee to steelworkers became the executive who viewed employees as line items on spreadsheets. His ex-wife Jennifer would later tell investigators that Theodore had become a stranger in his own life, a man who'd traded his humanity for market share. She had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be, or how much blood would be on Theodore's hands before he finally understood what he'd become. 600 miles away from Theodore's corporate penthouse, Grace Williams was fighting a very different kind of battle. At 58, Grace had lived through more heartbreak than most people could imagine, but she'd never lost her faith in the fundamental goodness of people, or her belief that speaking up for others was a moral obligation. Born in Mississippi in 1965, she'd moved to Chicago at 19, with her husband Robert and a head full of dreams about northern opportunities. They were young, in love, and convinced that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. Robert worked construction, while Grace cleaned houses during the day and took night classes to become a certified nursing assistant. They were building something together, a life, a family, a future for the children they planned to have. But in 1994, a scaffolding collapse took Robert's life and left Grace a widow at 29. She was pregnant with their first child, Maria, and facing a world that suddenly seemed impossibly cruel and unfair. Grace Williams could have given up. She could have moved back to Mississippi, lived with her mother, and raised her daughter in the familiar comfort of extended family. Instead, she made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She decided to stay in Chicago and fight for the future she and Robert had dreamed of together. Grace worked 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school while raising Maria alone: emergency room aide during the day, weekend house cleaner, and night shift at a 24-hour diner, because that's what mothers do when the world tries to break them. They find a way to keep going, not for themselves, but for the children who depend on them. For 15 years, Grace worked as a nursing assistant, caring for elderly patients with the same tenderness she showed her own daughter. She believed that healing was sacred work, that dignity was every person's birthright, and that speaking up for those who couldn't speak for themselves was a moral obligation that transcended job descriptions or paychecks. Grace had a gift for seeing past the surface of people's lives to the pain and hope underneath. She could calm a confused dementia patient with a gentle touch, help a proud elderly man maintain his dignity while accepting help with basic tasks, and somehow always know exactly what family members needed to hear during their darkest moments. Her supervisors praised her compassion, her coworkers sought her advice, and her patients' families sent thank you cards years after their loved ones had passed away. But in 2009, budget cuts eliminated Grace's position at the hospital. At 44, she found herself starting over again, this time at Blackwood's family diner, taking orders and serving coffee to make ends meet. She told herself it was temporary, just until something better came along. But temporary became permanent when her daughter Maria was diagnosed with lupus in 2016, and Grace discovered that love makes you capable of anything, including working double shifts at a job that barely paid enough to survive. The medical bills were crushing, $3,200 a month for treatments, with college costs looming at $35,000 a year for her grandson Marcus, Maria's son from a relationship that ended when the young man couldn't handle the responsibility of dating a woman with a chronic illness. Grace Williams had something that Theodore Blackwood's billions couldn't buy: a community that knew her heart, and a reputation built on 40 years of showing up for people when they needed her most. She was the person you called when your electricity got shut off, and you needed help navigating the bureaucracy to get it turned back on. She was the one who organized meal trains for families dealing with medical crises, who babysat for single mothers working night shifts, who somehow always had an extra $20 for someone whose rent was due. Grace Williams had spent decades being the person who caught other people when they fell, but she was about to discover that sometimes catching others means risking your own safe landing. At Blackwood's, Grace became the unofficial mother figure to a staff of mostly young, mostly struggling employees. She taught new hires how to manage difficult customers, helped them budget their paychecks, and somehow found ways to cover their shifts when life got overwhelming. When 18-year-old Jennifer couldn't afford her school books, Grace quietly paid for them and told her it was a loan that could be repaid whenever convenient. When Marcus, a 22-year-old father of 2, got evicted from his apartment, Grace let his family stay in her living room for 3 months while he saved money for a new deposit. These weren't grand gestures or calculated investments in employee loyalty. They were simply what Grace Williams did, as naturally as breathing, because she understood that taking care of each other was what made communities survive. But Grace Williams had something else that would prove far more dangerous to Theodore Blackwood's empire: a mother's intuition, a grandmother's wisdom, and an unshakable belief that when you witness injustice, you speak up, no matter who's listening, and no matter what it might cost you. She had learned this lesson at her own mother's knee, watching a woman who cleaned white families' houses during the day come home and organize voter registration drives at night. Grace's mother had taught her that silence in the face of wrongdoing wasn't just cowardice, it was complicity. That lesson would guide Grace Williams through the most dangerous decision of her life. By 2023, Theodore Blackwood was facing the biggest crisis of his corporate career, though he didn't yet understand that the real crisis wasn't financial, but moral. Profits were down 18% across the chain. Labor costs were increasing as minimum wage laws in key markets forced higher baseline salaries. Customer satisfaction scores were declining in inner-city locations. Shareholders were growing restless and board members were asking pointed questions about Theodore's leadership during increasingly tense quarterly meetings. The pressure was immense, relentless, and completely focused on one thing: maximizing profits regardless of human cost. The board wanted answers delivered with the ruthless efficiency that had built the Blackwood empire in the first place. They weren't interested in excuses about economic conditions or changing demographics. They wanted solutions that would restore profit margins to previous levels, and they wanted them implemented immediately. Board member Charles Morrison, a venture capitalist with holdings in 12 restaurant chains, put it bluntly during a private meeting with Theodore. "We're not running a charity here, Theodore. These inner-city locations are bleeding money because you're too sentimental about employees who frankly aren't worth the investment. We need to make hard decisions about which markets are profitable and which ones we should abandon entirely." But closing restaurants meant eliminating jobs in communities that desperately needed them, communities like the South Side of Chicago, where Grace Williams and hundreds of other employees depended on their Blackwood paychecks to survive. Theodore found himself caught between his board's demands for increased profitability and his fading memories of his grandmother's values about treating employees with dignity. The pressure was enormous, coming from every direction, and Theodore Blackwood was about to make a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was about to discover that when you compromise your values incrementally, you can end up in a place you never intended to go, doing things you never thought you were capable of doing. What happened next would become the darkest chapter in Blackwood Industries' corporate history, though Theodore wouldn't understand the full implications of his decision until it was far too late to prevent the devastating consequences. Faced with relentless board pressure and sliding profits, Theodore authorized a comprehensive efficiency review designed to cut costs and maximize profitability across all locations. The consulting firm of Morrison Associates promised a 35% reduction in labor costs within 18 months, presenting a 47-page plan called Operation Efficiency that would optimize human resources and eliminate redundant operational expenses. Theodore Blackwood signed the authorization during a 15-minute window between meetings, trusting his executives to implement humane cost-cutting measures that would preserve jobs while improving efficiency. He assumed they shared his values about treating employees with dignity, that they understood the difference between trimming expenses and destroying lives. He was catastrophically, devastatingly wrong. The executives saw Operation Efficiency as permission to implement policies that would have horrified the young man who'd opened his first diner to serve his community. Policies that treated human beings as disposable assets whose suffering was acceptable as long as it improved quarterly profit reports. The consulting firm's plan contained recommendations that were breathtaking in their callousness and systematic in their cruelty. Page 23 suggested that natural workforce reduction through health-related attrition would be more cost-effective than layoffs, which triggered unemployment benefits and potential wrongful termination lawsuits. Page 31 recommended that employees with chronic health conditions should be managed through strategic scheduling reductions and insurance claim delays until voluntary resignation occurred. Page 38 advised that incident reporting should be minimized to essential legal requirements only, as detailed documentation of workplace accidents and health emergencies created unnecessary liability exposure. Grace Williams started noticing the changes in small ways at first, the kind of subtle shifts that might escape notice unless you'd been working in the same place for 8 years and cared deeply about your coworkers' well-being. Shifts were getting cut without explanation, leaving employees scrambling to find additional work to make up for lost income. Health insurance claims were taking longer to process, with previously approved treatments suddenly requiring additional documentation that seemed designed to exhaust people until they gave up. The coffee machine that used to get repaired within a day now stayed broken for weeks, creating safety hazards and making an already difficult job even more stressful. Then the departures began, longtime employees suddenly quitting without notice or being terminated for minor infractions that used to warrant nothing more than a verbal warning. People who had worked at Blackwood's for years, who had perfect attendance records and positive performance reviews, were suddenly finding themselves unemployed for violations of policies that seemed to change daily. Grace watched coworkers she'd trained, people she considered family, clean out their lockers with tears in their eyes and fear in their voices about how they'd pay rent or afford their medications without steady income. Maria Santos was the first to approach Grace privately about what was happening. A 34-year-old single mother of 3, Maria had worked at Blackwood's for 6 years and had always been one of the most reliable, hard-working employees on the staff. She was diabetic, dependent on insulin to survive, and her prescription had been denied by the company's new insurance policy for reasons that made no medical sense. The insurance company claimed her diabetes was a pre-existing condition that wasn't covered under the new plan, despite the fact that she'd been successfully managing her condition with company insurance for years. Grace spent hours on the phone with insurance representatives, trying to navigate a bureaucracy that seemed designed to wear down anyone who dared to question their decisions. Every department transferred her to another department, every manager claimed they couldn't help with insurance issues, and every appeal resulted in requests for additional documentation that hadn't been required previously. The system seemed specifically engineered to exhaust people until they gave up, accepted their fate, and quietly disappeared from the company's financial obligations. 2 weeks after her insulin prescription was denied, Maria Santos collapsed during her morning shift at Blackwood's. Grace found her unconscious in the storage room, surrounded by boxes of supplies, her skin cold and clammy, her breathing shallow and irregular. The paramedics said it was diabetic coma, brought on by dangerously high blood sugar levels that could have been easily prevented with proper medication. Maria spent 3 days in intensive care at Cook County Hospital before her body finally gave up the fight it had been losing since her insurance coverage was eliminated. Grace Williams held Maria's 3 children at their mother's funeral, looking into the faces of kids aged 12, 9, and 6, who couldn't understand why their mother had to die from a condition that was completely manageable with proper medical care. The oldest child, a 12-year-old girl named Sophia, kept asking Grace why the medicine that kept her mother alive for years was suddenly too expensive to buy. Grace had no answer that made sense, no way to explain that Maria Santos had died not because medicine didn't exist to save her, but because someone had decided her life wasn't worth the cost of keeping her alive. Standing in that cemetery, watching 3 children say goodbye to their mother, Grace Williams made a promise that would change everything. She would not let Maria Santos die for nothing. She would make sure that someone, somewhere, was held accountable for the policies that had killed a hard-working single mother whose only crime was getting sick while employed by a company that viewed her medical needs as an unacceptable expense. That night, Grace Williams began keeping records, not corporate reports or legal documents, but human stories. Names, faces, families, evidence of what was happening to real people while executives focused on profit margins and quarterly reports. What Grace didn't know was that Maria Santos was just the beginning, the first casualty in a war on working families that would claim 11 more lives before Grace found the courage to risk everything by telling the truth to the one person who had the power to stop it. Over the next 18 months, Grace would document a pattern of corporate negligence so systematic and callous that it amounted to nothing less than murder by spreadsheet, death by policy decision, the calculated sacrifice of human lives for improved profit margins. Grace held that little girl at the funeral, promising to help however she could, knowing that promises couldn't bring back a father who died because medicine that cost pennies to manufacture was priced beyond the reach of working families. Lisa Rodriguez was 41 years old, a single mother of 3 teenagers, working double shifts to pay for her son's college application fees and her daughter's school supplies. The new insurance plan didn't cover preventive care, so Lisa ignored the chest pains and shortness of breath that had been getting worse for months. She couldn't afford to miss work for doctor visits, couldn't afford the cost of diagnostic tests, couldn't afford to discover she might have a serious condition that would require expensive treatment. Lisa died of a massive heart attack during her shift, collapsing while taking an order from a customer who tried unsuccessfully to perform CPR until paramedics arrived. Grace was the one who called Lisa's children to tell them their mother wasn't coming home, wasn't going to see her son graduate from high school, or her daughter's first prom. David Thompson was 52 years old, a veteran who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan and came home to work at Blackwood's because he believed in honest work and supporting his community. Over the next year, Grace Williams became an unofficial historian of corporate casualties, documenting each death, each family destroyed, each life cut short by policies designed to maximize profits while minimizing human decency. Her small apartment became a memorial to people who had worked themselves to death in service of a company that viewed their suffering as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of quarterly growth targets. James Mitchell was 45 years old, a father of 2 teenage daughters who dreamed of becoming the first generation in their family to attend college. James worked double shifts with no breaks, often going 14 hours without sitting down, because operation efficiency had eliminated the requirement for mandatory rest periods. He had a minor heart condition that was manageable with medication and reasonable working conditions. But the new insurance plan didn't cover cardiac medications that weren't considered life-threatening emergencies. Grace found James collapsed in the storage room during a particularly busy lunch rush, clutching a photo of his daughters that he kept in his wallet to remind himself why he endured the impossible working conditions. The girls told Grace at their father's funeral that James had been working 70-hour weeks to save money for their college funds, determined to give them opportunities he'd never had. Now they would be working part-time jobs just to help their mother pay the mortgage on a house that held too many memories of a man who'd worked himself to death trying to provide for his family. The older daughter, 16-year-old Ashley, asked Grace why her father had to die from a heart attack that doctors said could have been prevented with proper medication and reasonable working hours. Grace had no answer that made sense. Sarah Chen was 28 years old, working 3 jobs to support her elderly parents after their small business failed during the economic downturn. She worked overnight shifts at Blackwood's, morning shifts at a grocery store, and afternoon shifts cleaning office buildings, sleeping maybe 4 hours a night and living on coffee and determination. The new scheduling system required employees to be available for shifts with less than 24 hours notice, making it impossible to maintain regular sleep schedules or coordinate multiple jobs effectively. Sarah died in a car accident driving home after working 16 straight hours, falling asleep at the wheel 3 blocks from her apartment. Grace sat with Sarah's parents even though they shared no common language except tears, some griefs transcending words and cultural barriers. By the end of 2023, Grace had documented 12 deaths, all preventable, all employees who died because they couldn't afford health care, couldn't afford to miss work, couldn't afford to live and work under the conditions that Operation Efficiency had created. But these weren't just statistics to Grace Williams. These were friends, coworkers, people whose children she'd watched grow up, whose dreams she'd listened to during quiet moments between customers, whose struggles she'd witnessed and tried to help alleviate whenever possible. Marcus Johnson was 34 years old, father of 2 children under 5, working to support his family while his wife attended nursing school. His diabetes medication cost $340 per month without insurance coverage, money the family simply didn't have after Operation Efficiency reduced his hours from full-time to part-time status. Marcus tried to manage his condition with diet and exercise alone, but diabetes doesn't care about good intentions or financial limitations. He died of diabetic coma in his apartment, found by his 4-year-old daughter who didn't understand why Daddy wouldn't wake up. The new scheduling system eliminated consistent shifts, making it impossible for David to maintain the routine and stability that helped him manage his post-traumatic stress disorder. Without regular sleep patterns and predictable schedules, David's mental health deteriorated rapidly. The employee assistance program that had previously provided counseling services was eliminated as a cost-cutting measure. David died by suicide in the restaurant's parking lot after a particularly difficult shift, leaving behind a note apologizing to his coworkers for not being strong enough to keep fighting. While Grace was documenting how corporate policies were systematically killing her coworkers, those same policies were threatening the life of the person she loved most in the world. Her daughter Maria's lupus was getting progressively worse, and the new insurance plan covered basic treatment, but denied coverage for the experimental therapy that could give her a normal life expectancy. The experimental treatment cost $4,800 per month, Money that Grace's salary of $2,100 couldn't possibly cover, even working double shifts and her weekend cleaning job. Every night, Grace Williams sat at her kitchen table with bills spread out before her, trying to make impossible mathematics work through sheer force of will and maternal determination. Rent, plus utilities, plus groceries, plus Maria's basic medications, plus her grandson's school supplies. The numbers never balanced, there was never enough, and Grace was slowly coming to the terrible realization that she might have to watch her daughter die because she couldn't afford to keep her alive. The stress was literally killing Grace too, manifesting in chest pains and sleepless nights, high blood pressure and constant anxiety about tomorrow's financial crisis. The doctor's consultation that changed everything took place on a cold Thursday morning in February. Dr. Patricia Williams, no relation but someone who'd become a trusted friend over the years of Maria's treatment, delivered the news with professional compassion but devastating clarity. What Grace didn't know was that her letters to Theodore Blackwood never reached his office. Corporate security had identified her as a disgruntled employee and flagged her correspondence to be intercepted and destroyed before it could reach executive leadership. The security team, led by former FBI agent Robert Harrison, maintained detailed files on employees who were considered potential threats to corporate interests, and Grace Williams had been placed on their watch list after her repeated calls to the ethics hotline. The corporate cover-up was systematic and sophisticated, designed to prevent exactly the kind of exposure that Grace was attempting to create. Employee deaths were reported to local authorities as required by law, but the circumstances surrounding those deaths were carefully documented in ways that minimized corporate liability. Heart attacks were attributed to personal health choices rather than working conditions. Car accidents were blamed on driver error rather than mandatory overtime policies. Suicides were treated as individual mental health crises rather than symptoms of systematic workplace abuse. Internal emails between executives revealed the true scope of the conspiracy to hide Operation Efficiency's human cost from Theodore Blackwood and the public. Chief Financial Officer Margaret Stevens wrote to Operations Director Thomas Wilson, expressing satisfaction that the quarterly reports showed significant improvement in labor cost reduction, without any mention of the methods used to achieve those results. "We're on track to exceed our efficiency targets by 12%, Stevens wrote. "The natural workforce reduction has been more effective than we projected, and we're seeing substantial savings in healthcare and workers' compensation claims." Human Resources Director Janet Morrison sent regular updates to the executive team about strategies for managing employee complaints and preventing negative publicity. "We've implemented new protocols for incident reporting that should minimize documentation of workplace-related health issues," Morrison wrote in one email. "The legal department has advised that we should avoid creating any written record that could suggest awareness of systemic problems with working conditions or employee welfare. The priority is maintaining plausible deniability while achieving maximum cost reduction through workforce optimization. Without the new treatment protocol, Maria's condition would continue to deteriorate at an accelerated pace. Based on current progression rates, they were looking at maybe 18 months before organ failure became irreversible. The experimental therapy could extend Maria's life by decades, possibly allowing her to see her son Marcus graduate from college, get married, have children of his own." That night, Grace Williams made a decision that would require more courage than most people summon in a lifetime. She decided that if the system wouldn't listen to proper channels, if official complaints disappeared into corporate bureaucracy, if phone calls went unanswered and letters were returned undelivered, then she would find another way to make her voice heard. She wrote in her journal that evening, words that would later be read in congressional hearings and quoted in news articles across the country. "If I have to choose between my job and my conscience, between my safety and my community's survival, then there's really no choice at all. Some things matter more than being comfortable, more than being safe, more than protecting yourself when others are dying around you." Grace Williams wasn't a lawyer or a trained investigator, but what she lacked in formal education she made up for in determination, compassion, and a lifetime of caring for others. She approached her investigation the way she approached everything else in her life, as an act of service to her community. a memorial to people who deserve to be remembered as more than statistics in corporate efficiency reports. These weren't case files she was building. They were tributes to friends, coworkers, people whose stories deserve to be told with dignity and truth. Grace attended every funeral, helping to organize meal trains for grieving families, babysitting children who'd lost parents, driving widows to Social Security offices, and somehow finding money in her own impossibly tight budget to help with burial costs. She wasn't gathering evidence for a lawsuit or building a case for prosecution. She was simply doing what Grace Williams had always done, taking care of people who needed help, honoring the dead by supporting the living they'd left behind. But Grace was also methodically documenting everything she witnessed, creating a record that would eventually expose the full scope of Operation Efficiency's human cost. She kept copies of denied insurance claims, documented instances of scheduling manipulation, recorded conversations with employees who were afraid to speak up officially, and photographed unsafe working conditions that violated basic health and safety regulations. Grace turned her small apartment into an archive of corporate malfeasance, organized with the same care she'd once used to maintain patient records at the hospital. She tried every official channel first, because Grace Williams had been raised to respect authority and follow proper procedures. She called the corporate ethics hotline repeatedly, only to have her calls transferred to voicemail systems that were never answered. She wrote letters to management that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. She even attempted to contact Theodore Blackwood directly, composing 3 carefully worded letters over 6 months that detailed the pattern of employee deaths and requested immediate intervention to prevent further casualties. Meanwhile, Theodore Blackwood was living in a bubble of corporate success that completely insulated him from the human cost of the policies he'd authorized. The quarterly reports he received showed exactly what he wanted to see: improved profit margins, reduced labor costs, increased efficiency ratings across all locations. The board meetings focused exclusively on financial metrics, stock performance, and competitive positioning in the market. Nobody mentioned employee deaths, insurance claim denials, or the systematic destruction of working families that was funding the company's return to profitability. Theodore's daily routine kept him far removed from the operational realities of his restaurants. He worked from a corporate headquarters that looked more like a luxury hotel than a food service business, surrounded by executives who filtered information to present only positive developments and successful initiatives. His calendar was filled with meetings about expansion strategies, marketing campaigns, and investor relations. The closest he came to actual restaurant operations was reviewing sanitized reports that reduced human suffering to statistical abstractions. The board was thrilled with Theodore's leadership during this period, praising his decisive action in authorizing Operation Efficiency and his commitment to shareholder value maximization. Board member Charles Morrison publicly commended Theodore's willingness to make difficult decisions for the long-term health of the company. "You've saved Blackwood Industries," Morrison told Theodore during one particularly congratulatory board meeting. "This is exactly the kind of courageous leadership we need to compete in today's market environment." But Theodore's ex-wife Jennifer saw something different during their monthly dinner meetings to discuss their teenage son, Michael's custody arrangements and school performance. She noticed that Theodore looked hollow, disconnected from conversations about his son's life, more interested in checking his phone for stock price updates than listening to stories about Michael's basketball games or academic achievements. "When did you last visit one of your restaurants?" Jennifer asked during one of these dinners. Not the corporate showcase locations where everything is perfect for photo opportunities, but one of the neighborhood places where your actual customers eat and your actual employees work. Theodore's response to Jennifer's question was dismissive at first. He didn't need to micromanage operations, he explained. That's what regional managers and district supervisors were for. But the question bothered him more than he wanted to admit, nagging at him during quiet moments when he wasn't distracted by meetings and conference calls. That night, Theodore found himself looking through old photographs from the early days of Blackwood Industries, pictures of him working alongside employees, serving customers, cleaning tables after closing time. He discovered the original loan documents his grandmother had signed, her handwriting faded but still legible after all these years. The paperwork included a handwritten note that Theodore had completely forgotten about. For Theo's dream of feeding his community with love and respect. Remember that success means lifting others up, not stepping on them to reach higher ground. Your employees are not your servants. They are your partners in building something meaningful. Treat them like family, because that's what they are. Reading his grandmother's words, Theodore felt a profound disconnection between the values that had inspired his original dream and the corporate machine he'd built in pursuit of that dream. He realized he hadn't spoken to a frontline employee in months, hadn't visited a restaurant during normal operating hours in over a year, hadn't witnessed firsthand how the policies he approved affected the people who implemented them daily. The board's praise for his leadership suddenly felt hollow, based on metrics that told him nothing about whether he was actually achieving his grandmother's vision of community service through honest business practices. The decision to go undercover wasn't planned or calculated. It emerged from a growing sense that Theodore had lost touch with the fundamental purpose of his business, that somewhere between building an empire and managing shareholder expectations, he'd forgotten why he'd wanted to open restaurants in the first place. He spent a weekend researching the lowest performing locations according to the new efficiency metrics, trying to understand why certain restaurants were struggling despite the implementation of cost-cutting measures that should have improved their financial performance. The Cottage Grove location in Chicago appeared at the bottom of every performance ranking, showing consistent losses despite aggressive implementation of operation efficiency protocols. The reports painted a picture of lazy employees, entitled customers, and operational inefficiencies that resisted standard management solutions. But something about the clinical language in these reports bothered Theodore. The way human beings were reduced to statistical problems that could be solved through policy adjustments and procedural modifications. Theodore Blackwood hadn't worn a disguise since college theater classes, but he planned this deception with the same thoroughness that had built his corporate empire. He created a fake identity as Tom Baker, recently laid off from a manufacturing job, looking for a quiet place to drink coffee and read want ads while searching for new employment opportunities. The backstory was close enough to his father's experience to feel authentic, grounded in working-class realities that Theodore remembered from his childhood in Gary, Indiana. On Tuesday, February 22, 2024, at 6:47 a.m., two worlds were about to collide in ways that would change everything for both Theodore Blackwood and Grace Williams. Theodore's rental car pulled up to the Cottage Grove Blackwood's location, as Grace was inside preparing for another impossibly difficult day of covering for understaffed shifts while dealing with broken equipment and increasingly desperate coworkers. Grace had been at the restaurant since 5 a.m., starting coffee, prepping food, and mentally preparing for what she knew would be another 12-hour marathon of serving customers while worrying about her daughter's deteriorating health and her own family's financial survival. She was running on 3 hours of sleep, her fourth cup of coffee, and the kind of grim determination that comes from having no choice but to keep going, regardless of how impossible the circumstances become. When the door chimed at 6:47 a.m., Grace looked up to see a man she didn't recognize, middle-aged and tired-looking, carrying a folded newspaper and wearing clothes that seemed too new for someone who was genuinely unemployed. But it was his eyes that caught Grace's attention, the way they moved around the restaurant, taking inventory of details that most customers never noticed. Grace Williams had been reading people for 58 years, and something about this particular customer made her intuition start sending warning signals that she couldn't quite identify or explain. The initial interaction seemed completely ordinary. Grace poured coffee with the same professional courtesy she'd shown thousands of customers over 8 years of working at Blackwood's. But something about this man's presence felt different, charged with significance that Grace couldn't understand, but couldn't ignore. She found herself paying attention to him in a way that would change both their lives forever, watching how he observed the restaurant's operations, noting the questions he asked, and the way he seemed to be cataloging everything he witnessed. For the next 3 hours, Theodore Blackwood observed his restaurant like an anthropologist studying an unfamiliar culture, because in many ways he was encountering a world he'd created, but never truly understood. The coffee machine leaked constantly, creating safety hazards and wasting expensive product. The grill temperature fluctuated wildly, making consistent food quality impossible and forcing employees to constantly adjust cooking times and methods. The cash register jammed every 20 transactions, slowing service and creating frustrated customers who blamed workers for technological failures beyond their control. But worse than the equipment failures were the human costs that Theodore had never calculated or considered. Grace Williams was doing the work of 3 people, while somehow maintaining the warmth and dignity that kept customers returning to a restaurant that should have failed months ago. She remembered regular customers' preferences, helped elderly patrons count exact change for their modest breakfast orders, and somehow found ways to show kindness and patience even while managing multiple crises simultaneously. Theodore watched Grace help an elderly customer who was 50 cents short for his breakfast, quietly making up the difference from her own tips without making the man feel ashamed of his financial limitations. He observed her bringing free coffee refills to a teenager who was using the restaurant's Wi-Fi to fill out job applications, encouraging him to keep trying and offering suggestions about local businesses that might be hiring. These were acts of emotional labor that no corporate manual could quantify, human connections that created community value far beyond anything that appeared on quarterly profit reports. As the morning progressed, Grace Williams realized with growing certainty that the quiet customer nursing his coffee and newspaper was not who he appeared to be. The way he watched operations, the questions he asked about menu items and restaurant policies, the fact that he'd been sitting in the same booth for 3 hours while taking what appeared to be mental notes about everything he observed. Grace had been trying to reach Theodore Blackwood through official channels for months, and now she was almost certain he was sitting 20 feet away from her, disguised but not hidden from a woman who'd spent her entire life seeing through facades and recognizing truth beneath surface appearances. At 9:23 a.m., Grace Williams made the most courageous decision of her life, a choice that would require more bravery than most people summon in a lifetime. She tore a piece of paper from her order pad and began writing words that would risk everything she'd worked for while potentially saving lives she cared about more than her own safety. Her hands were shaking as she wrote, not from fear, but from the enormous weight of what she was about to do. Grace Williams was about to bet her family's survival on the hope that somewhere inside the billionaire CEO was still a trace of the young man who'd opened his first restaurant to serve his community with love and dignity. When Grace walked over to refill Tom Baker's coffee one final time, she was carrying more than a coffee pot. She was carrying the hopes of 12 dead employees, the desperation of families destroyed by corporate policies, the dreams of coworkers who deserved better than being treated as disposable assets in someone else's profit calculations. Without saying a word, she placed the folded piece of paper next to his coffee cup, then looked directly into Theodore Blackwood's eyes and spoke 4 words that would echo in his memory forever. Please don't let them die for nothing. Grace walked away before Theodore could respond, returning to her station behind the counter where she continued serving customers while watching from the corner of her eye as the most powerful man in the food service industry unfolded a piece of paper that contained the truth about what his corporate empire had become. Theodore almost threw the note away, assuming it was another customer complaint or request for special accommodations. But something in Grace's voice, something in the way she'd looked at him, made him smooth out the creased paper and read the words that would shatter his understanding of everything he thought he'd built. 7 words, written in Grace's careful handwriting. Your employees are dying, Mr. Blackwood. For 30 seconds, Theodore sat frozen as the sounds of the restaurant faded to nothing around him. Conversations between customers became meaningless background noise. The clinking of dishes and the hiss of the coffee machine disappeared into silence. How had she identified him through his disguise? What did she mean by employees dying? And then he turned the paper over and discovered that Grace Williams had been documenting corporate casualties with the thoroughness of a war correspondent and the compassion of a grieving mother. On the back of the note wasn't just a list of names and dates. It was a memorial written by someone who had known and cared about each person, whose life had been cut short by policies designed to maximize profits while minimizing human dignity. Maria Santos, 34, diabetic coma, mother of 3 children under 12. James Mitchell, 45. Heart attack during double shift. Father of 2 teenage daughters. Sarah Chen, 28. Car accident after 16-hour shift. Only child supporting elderly parents. Marcus Johnson, 34. Diabetic complications. Father of 2 toddlers under 5. Each entry contained not just clinical details about cause of death, but personal information that transformed statistics into human stories. Lisa Rodriguez, 41. Heart attack during shift. Single mother working to pay for son's college applications. David Thompson, 52. Suicide in parking lot. Veteran struggling with eliminated mental health benefits. Patricia Williams, 39. Untreated cancer. Chose to work instead of seeking medical care she couldn't afford. Michael Brown, 47. Stroke after mandatory overtime. Coaching his daughter's soccer team in his spare time. The list continued with details that made each death personal and preventable. Jennifer Martinez, 33. Complications from untreated diabetes. Planning her son's quinceañera when she collapsed. Robert Johnson, 51. Heart attack during inventory. 3 months from retirement and excited about spending time with grandchildren. Carol Thompson, 44. Car accident after split shift. Driving between 2 jobs to afford her mother's nursing home care. Thomas Wilson, 38. Suicide after losing health insurance. Father of 4 children who didn't understand why daddy couldn't get his depression medication anymore. But it was the final line that broke Theodore Blackwood completely. Words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Mr. Blackwood, I don't want to be number 13, but my daughter needs her mother to fight for what's right, even when fighting might cost everything. These weren't the words of a disgruntled employee looking for attention or compensation. This was the testimony of a woman who was willing to risk her own survival to prevent other families from experiencing the losses she'd witnessed and documented with heartbreaking precision. Theodore Blackwood stood up so quickly that he knocked over his coffee cup, sending hot liquid spreading across the table and dripping onto the floor. Grace watched from behind the counter as the most powerful man in the food service industry stumbled toward the exit like someone who'd just received news of a death in the family. In many ways, that's exactly what had happened. Theodore was discovering that he'd been presiding over the systematic destruction of the very people he'd claimed to serve, that his pursuit of efficiency had become a machine that consumed human lives while generating quarterly profit reports. In the parking lot, Theodore sat in his rental car and experienced something he hadn't felt since his grandmother's funeral: complete emotional collapse. These weren't tears of self-pity or professional frustration. These were tears of recognition, the devastating realization that he had become someone his grandmother wouldn't recognize, someone who had traded every value she'd taught him for stock options and board approval. The young man who'd promised to treat every employee like family had become a corporate executive whose policies were systematically killing the very people he'd sworn to protect and support. His first phone call was to his head of security, demanding immediate answers about the names on Grace's list and the circumstances surrounding their deaths. His voice was shaking as he read each name, asking why he'd never been informed about employee fatalities, why nobody had thought to mention that people were dying in ways that seemed directly connected to workplace conditions and company policies. The security chief's responses were evasive and bureaucratic, full of language about individual health choices and personal circumstances that had nothing to do with corporate responsibility or workplace safety. Theodore's second call was to his personal physician, asking whether stress and overwork could cause fatal heart attacks in otherwise healthy adults, whether untreated diabetes could kill someone who couldn't afford insulin, whether people really died from preventable causes when they couldn't access basic medical care. The doctor's answers confirmed Theodore's growing horror. Every death on Grace's list was preventable, the result of policies that forced people to choose between earning money and preserving their health, between keeping their jobs and seeking medical treatment for conditions that could be managed with proper care and reasonable working conditions. What Theodore discovered over the next 48 hours would expose a cover-up that reached the highest levels of his own company and reveal that Grace Williams had been conducting her own investigation with the skill of a trained researcher and the determination of someone fighting for justice. Corporate security files contained detailed records of employee complaints that had been systematically suppressed, insurance claims that had been deliberately delayed or denied, and incident reports that had been modified to minimize corporate liability while maximizing employee responsibility for their own suffering. The pattern was unmistakable once Theodore started looking for it. Employees with chronic health conditions were being managed through strategic scheduling reductions designed to force voluntary resignation. Workers who filed insurance appeals or complained about working conditions found themselves subjected to performance reviews that documented minor infractions never previously considered worthy of discipline. The most vulnerable employees, those with families to support and limited alternative employment options, were being systematically exploited through policies that treated their desperation as a competitive advantage. Internal emails between executives revealed the true scope of the conspiracy to hide Operation Efficiency's human cost from Theodore and the public. Chief Financial Officer Margaret Stevens had been sending quarterly updates, celebrating the success of workforce reduction strategies, noting that natural attrition through health-related departures was exceeding projections while generating substantial savings in healthcare and workers' compensation claims. "We're achieving unprecedented efficiency levels," Stevens wrote to the executive team. "The elimination of redundant personnel through health-related departures is contributing significantly to our improved profit margins." Operations Director Thomas Wilson had been coordinating with insurance providers to maximize claim denials while maintaining legal compliance with employee benefit requirements. "We've successfully transitioned to a new insurance partner that specializes in rigorous claim review processes," Wilson reported to the board. "Their denial rates for expensive treatments and experimental procedures are significantly higher than our previous provider, resulting in substantial cost savings while technically maintaining employee health coverage as required by law." Human Resources Director Janet Morrison's emails provided the most damning evidence of systematic cruelty disguised as business efficiency. Morrison had been tracking individual employees with chronic health conditions, developing strategies to encourage their departure through scheduling manipulation, benefit reductions, and performance management designed to create impossible working conditions. "We've identified approximately 47 employees across all locations who represent disproportionate healthcare costs," Morrison wrote in one email. "I recommend implementing targeted management strategies to encourage voluntary resignation while avoiding wrongful termination liability." The insurance manipulation was even more calculated and cruel than Theodore had imagined. The company had partnered with a provider that specialized in claim denials, particularly for employees with chronic conditions that required expensive ongoing treatment. Internal documents showed that Blackwood Industries was paying bonuses to insurance administrators based on denial rates, creating financial incentives to reject legitimate medical claims from employees who needed life-saving treatment. The insurance company's internal motto, discovered during Theodore's investigation, was particularly chilling: delay, deny, defend, until they die or disappear. Employee deaths were being celebrated in internal communications as successful cost reduction measures. An email from CFO Margaret Stevens to the executive team expressed satisfaction that James Mitchell's fatal heart attack would save the company approximately $47,000 in projected healthcare costs over the next 5 years. Similarly, Maria Santos's death from diabetic complications was noted as eliminating ongoing insulin costs that had been averaging $340 per month. These weren't isolated comments from a single callous executive. They represented a systematic approach to human resource management that treated employee deaths as profitable business outcomes. The most devastating discovery was a detailed spreadsheet maintained by HR Director Janet Morrison that tracked employees by their projected healthcare costs, ranking them from most to least expensive in terms of long-term medical expenses. Grace Williams appeared on this list as employee number 43, with a notation that her daughter's lupus treatment represented a significant financial liability that should be managed through strategic policy adjustments. The spreadsheet included recommendations for encouraging Grace's departure through scheduling reductions and insurance claim delays, with the goal of eliminating her family's medical expenses from the company's financial obligations. Theodore Blackwood spent 3 sleepless nights reading every document, every email, every insurance denial that had been implemented in his name, while he focused on board meetings and stock performance reports. What he discovered wasn't just corporate negligence or bureaucratic indifference. It was systematic cruelty implemented by people he'd trusted to share his values, executed by executives who had taken his authorization of operation efficiency as permission to treat human beings as disposable assets in pursuit of quarterly profit targets. His signature was on policies that condemned employees to death. His company letterhead was on insurance denials that forced families to choose between medical treatment and basic survival needs. His executive team had transformed his restaurant empire into a machine that consumed working families, while generating profit reports that made him look like a successful leader to shareholders who never saw the human cost of their investment returns. Theodore realized that he had become complicit in something that violated every principle his grandmother had taught him about treating employees with dignity and respect. The board's praise for his leadership during this period now felt like mockery. Charles Morrison's commendation of Theodore's decisive action in implementing operation efficiency took on a horrifying new meaning when understood as congratulations for policies that had systematically killed 12 people and threatened hundreds more. The stock price increases and profit margin improvements that had been celebrated at board meetings were literally built on the bodies of employees who had been worked to death or denied medical care in service of shareholder value maximization. On February 25th, Theodore Blackwood did something unprecedented in 30 years of corporate leadership. He personally called an employee to apologize, dialing Grace Williams' home number with hands that shook from shame and determination to make things right. The conversation that followed would change both their lives forever, transforming a corporate executive who had lost his way into someone committed to honoring his grandmother's values, regardless of the personal cost. Grace Williams was sitting at her kitchen table, surrounded by medical bills and college application materials for her grandson, when the phone rang at 9:37 p.m. She almost didn't answer, assuming it was another debt collector or insurance company representative calling to explain why her daughter's treatment had been denied again. The voice on the other end was hesitant, uncertain, completely different from the confident corporate executive she had imagined when she wrote his name on that piece of paper. "Mrs. Williams, this is Theodore Blackwood. I need to apologize to you, and I need to ask what I can do to fix this mess that I've created." Grace's first instinct was disbelief. Corporate executives didn't call employees at home, especially not billionaire CEOs apologizing to grandmothers who worked double shifts to afford their family's medical care. But something in Theodore's voice convinced her that this was genuine, that the man on the phone was experiencing the same kind of moral crisis that had kept her awake for months while she documented her coworkers' deaths. "Mr. Blackwood," Grace replied, "I didn't give you that note to destroy you or your company. I gave it to you because I saw something in your eyes that reminded me of my late husband, someone who had lost his way but still had goodness in his heart. I saw a man who might listen if someone had the courage to tell him the truth about what his policies were doing to real families." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Grace sharing details about each person on her list, transforming them from statistics into human beings with dreams, fears, families, and futures that had been cut short by corporate indifference. Theodore listened without interrupting as Grace described Maria Santos's 3 children, now living with their grandmother, and struggling to understand why their mother had to die from a condition that was completely manageable with proper medical care. He heard about James Mitchell's daughters, working part-time jobs to help pay for their father's funeral expenses while trying to maintain their grades and college preparations. Grace told him about Sarah Chen's elderly parents who spoke limited English but whose grief needed no translation, and David Thompson's suicide note apologizing to his co-workers for not being strong enough to keep fighting against impossible circumstances. For the second time in a week, Theodore Blackwood found himself crying during a phone conversation with an employee. But these weren't tears of self-pity or professional embarrassment. These were tears of recognition and responsibility. Acknowledgement that he had caused immeasurable suffering through policies he had authorized without understanding their human consequences. Grace Williams, dying because of insurance denials that bore his corporate signature, wasn't demanding revenge or compensation. She was offering forgiveness and requesting change, giving him an opportunity to honor the memory of people whose deaths he had inadvertently caused. What Grace told Theodore next would become the foundation for everything that followed, the moral framework that would guide his transformation from profit-focused executive to community-focused entrepreneur. "Mr. Blackwood," Grace said, "your grandmother used to attend my church before she passed away. She talked about a young man who opened a restaurant to feed people, not to profit from their hunger. She told me that sometimes good people make bad choices when they forget who they used to be, but that doesn't mean they can't remember and choose differently going forward." Grace had known Theodore's grandmother Ella May through their shared church community, had listened to her proud stories about her grandson's success and her worried observations about how corporate life was changing him in ways that concerned her. Ella May had confided in Grace during her final months that she was afraid Theodore was losing touch with the values she had tried to teach him, that his pursuit of business success was costing him his connection to the community he had originally wanted to serve. "Your grandmother was proud of what you built," Grace continued, "but she was worried about what you were becoming. She told me that the restaurant business should be about creating community, providing jobs that allowed families to thrive, treating employees like the valuable human beings they are. She said that if business success required treating people badly, then maybe success was being defined wrong." Those words, spoken by a woman who was risking everything to tell him the truth, cut through decades of corporate justification and business school rationalization to reach something fundamental in Theodore's character. That night, Theodore Blackwood finally understood what he had lost. Not just his humanity or his connection to employee welfare, but his grandmother's legacy and the promise he had made to honor her values through his business practices. The young man who had sworn to treat every employee like family had become a corporate executive whose policies systematically destroyed families in pursuit of profit margins that impressed board members and satisfied shareholders who never witnessed the. 3 days after their phone conversation, Grace Williams collapsed during her morning shift at Blackwood's, the victim of a stress-induced cardiac event that doctors said was caused by months of working impossible hours while dealing with the psychological trauma of watching her coworkers die and her daughter's health deteriorate. The paramedics found her unconscious behind the counter, clutching a photo of her daughter Maria that she kept in her uniform pocket as a reminder of why she endured conditions that were literally killing her. The diagnosis was devastating: severe cardiac stress complicated by exhaustion, malnutrition, and untreated hypertension that had been building for months. Without immediate surgery and extended recovery time, Grace had maybe 6 months to live. The surgical procedure would cost $180,000, money that Grace's insurance plan would not cover because her condition was classified as resulting from lifestyle choices, corporate terminology for working too many hours to survive and caring too much about other people's welfare. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Theodore Blackwood. Grace Williams was going to die from the same insurance denials and workplace stress that had killed the 12 employees she had been trying to honor through her documentation and advocacy. The woman who had risked everything to save others was being killed by the same corporate policies she had fought to expose. Denied medical care by the same insurance company that had condemned her co-workers to preventable deaths. Theodore's response was immediate and unprecedented. Without consulting lawyers, board members, or corporate advisors, he personally transferred $180,000 to Cook County Hospital to pay for Grace's surgery and recovery care. When his CFO, Margaret Stevens, objected that this expenditure set a dangerous precedent for employee medical assistance, Theodore's response was simple and final. "Then we'll set more precedents like this one. If we can't afford to keep our employees alive, then we can't afford to be in business." The board of directors' response to Theodore's unauthorized expenditure and his growing commitment to employee welfare was swift and predictable. Emergency meetings were called, financial projections were revised, and shareholder concerns were discussed in terms that made clear Theodore's continued leadership was being questioned by people who viewed his moral awakening as a business liability that threatened their investment returns. Board member Charles Morrison led the opposition to Theodore's new direction, arguing that emotional decision-making was incompatible with fiduciary responsibility to shareholders who expected maximum return on investment. Theodore, Morrison said during one particularly heated board meeting, "You're allowing personal feelings to interfere with business judgment. Grace Williams is one employee out of thousands. You can't sacrifice company profitability to save individual workers who make poor health choices and create expensive medical claims." The board presented financial projections showing that Theodore's proposed changes to operation efficiency would cost the company over $300 million in the first year alone. Reinstating health benefits, reducing mandatory overtime, improving working conditions, and providing comprehensive medical coverage would eliminate quarterly profits and likely result in stock price declines that would anger institutional investors and retirement fund managers who depended on Blackwood Industries for steady returns. Theodore's response revealed how completely his priorities had changed during his investigation into Grace's allegations and his discovery of the systematic cruelty being implemented in his name. He told the board that his grandmother's $15,000 loan had been intended to create a business that served the community, not one that consumed community members in pursuit of profit maximization. If treating employees with dignity and respect was incompatible with shareholder expectations, then maybe the problem wasn't with employee treatment, but with shareholder expectations that required human suffering to generate acceptable returns. On March 15, 2024, Theodore Blackwood walked into the boardroom for what would be his final meeting as CEO of Blackwood Industries. He carried with him Grace Williams's documentation of employee deaths, internal emails revealing the systematic cover-up of corporate responsibility for those deaths, and a comprehensive plan for transforming company policies to prevent future casualties. But he also carried something more important: a renewed commitment to the values his grandmother had tried to teach him about treating business as an opportunity to serve others rather than exploit them. The board meeting began with CFO Margaret Stevens presenting quarterly profit reports that showed unprecedented success in cost reduction and efficiency improvements. Operation efficiency had exceeded all projections, she announced with satisfaction, generating savings that had restored Blackwood Industries to industry-leading profit margins while positioning the company for aggressive expansion into new markets. The presentation included charts and graphs that translated human suffering into financial success, employee deaths into cost savings, systematic cruelty into shareholder value creation. Theodore's response was comprehensive and devastating. He presented evidence of the 12 employee deaths, documented the corporate policies that had caused those deaths, and explained how executives had deliberately hidden this information from him while implementing increasingly cruel efficiency measures. He showed the board Grace Williams's investigation, her documentation of systematic insurance fraud, and her evidence that Operation Efficiency was essentially a program designed to kill employees while avoiding legal liability for their deaths. The board's reaction was immediate and predictable. Rather than expressing horror at the human cost of their efficiency programs, they expressed concern about legal liability and public relations consequences if Theodore's information became public. Board member Thomas Wilson suggested that the best strategy would be to quietly settle with affected families while maintaining Operation Efficiency under a different name, continuing the cost-saving measures while improving documentation to minimize future legal exposure. Theodore Blackwood's response to the board's callousness was the defining moment of his transformation from corporate executive to moral leader. He told them that Operation Efficiency would be completely eliminated, that all affected families would receive full compensation for medical expenses and wrongful death settlements, that employee health benefits would be restored to levels that actually protected worker welfare, and that working conditions would be improved to prevent future casualties, regardless of the cost to corporate profitability. The board's vote of no confidence was unanimous except for Theodore's own vote. 8-1 they removed him as CEO, citing financial irresponsibility, failure to maintain fiduciary duty to shareholders, and emotional decision-making that threatened the long-term viability of Blackwood Industries. The new CEO, brought in from a competing restaurant chain, announced that Operation Efficiency would continue under the name workforce optimization, with the same goals of cost reduction and employee management through strategic policy implementation. Theodore could have fought the board's decision through legal channels. His attorneys assured him that he had grounds for wrongful termination lawsuits that could restore his position and award millions in damages while exposing the board's complicity in policies that had killed 12 employees. The legal case was strong, the evidence was overwhelming, and the potential settlement would have been enormous. But Theodore Blackwood made a choice that surprised everyone, including himself. He walked away from the corporate empire he had built and decided to use his personal wealth to honor the promise he had made to Grace Williams. 6 months after losing his corporate position, Theodore opened his first community restaurant on the same Chicago block where Grace Williams had given him the note that shattered his comfortable illusions about corporate success. Grace, fully recovered from her surgery and stronger than ever, became his business partner and the restaurant's general manager. The opening celebration looked nothing like a corporate ribbon-cutting ceremony. Instead, it resembled a community block party, with former Blackwood employees, local residents, and the families of the 12 workers whose deaths had inspired this transformation. The guest list included people who had never been invited to corporate events. Maria Santos's 3 children, now thriving under their grandmother's care, and recipients of college scholarships funded by Theodore's personal foundation. James Mitchell's daughters, both maintaining excellent grades while working part-time jobs that provided work experience rather than survival necessity. Sarah Chen's elderly parents, who had been struggling with medical bills until Theodore's foundation stepped in to provide comprehensive health care coverage for immigrant families. Inside the restaurant, a memorial wall honored the 12 employees, whose deaths had sparked this transformation. Their photos were surrounded by pictures of their children, grandchildren, and family members who now received ongoing support through programs designed to ensure that no family would face the impossible choices that had killed their loved ones. The memorial wasn't morbid or depressing, it was celebratory, honoring lives that had meaning beyond corporate efficiency reports, people whose stories deserved to be remembered and whose families deserved support that went far beyond legal minimums. The new restaurant operated on a revolutionary business model that treated employee welfare as the foundation of customer service rather than an obstacle to profitability. Workers earned living wages that allowed them to support their families without working multiple jobs or impossible hours. Comprehensive healthcare coverage included experimental treatments, mental health services, and preventive care that addressed problems before they became life-threatening emergencies. Employees could request flexible scheduling to accommodate family responsibilities, educational goals, and personal health needs without fear of retaliation or termination. Grace Williams's courage in confronting corporate power had created consequences that extended far beyond her individual situation, or even Theodore Blackwood's personal transformation. Her story became a catalyst for national labor reform, inspiring congressional hearings that exposed similar practices at dozens of major corporations across multiple industries. The Grace Williams Act, passed 18 months after her initial confrontation with Theodore, now requires companies to report employee deaths and medical bankruptcies annually, creating transparency that makes systematic exploitation more difficult to hide from public scrutiny. Major retailers and restaurant chains, facing public pressure and boycott threats organized by labor advocates who had been inspired by Grace's example, began implementing their own employee protection measures. Her courage had given workers nationwide permission to speak truth to corporate power, demonstrating that individual action could create systemic change when people were willing to risk personal safety for collective welfare. Union organizers reported increased membership and successful contract negotiations in industries that had previously been considered impossible to organize. Grace's testimony before Congress, delivered while wearing her diner uniform to remind legislators about the reality of working-class life in America, became a defining moment in national debates about corporate responsibility and worker rights. "Senators," she said, "I'm not asking you to destroy business or punish success. I'm asking you to remember that the people who make businesses successful deserve to share in that success, not die for it." Those words were quoted in newspaper editorials, union organizing materials, and corporate responsibility reports across the country. The community restaurant movement that Grace and Theodore created spread faster than anyone expected. Within 18 months, there were 47 community restaurants in 23 states, all following the same principles of employee ownership, comprehensive benefits, and community service that had emerged from their partnership. These weren't charity operations or publicity stunts. They were profitable businesses that proved treating employees well was compatible with financial success when success was defined as community benefit rather than shareholder wealth maximization. Theodore Blackwood's net worth dropped from $3.2 billion to $12 million, a financial loss that represented the cost of buying back his soul and honoring his grandmother's values about treating business as an opportunity to serve others. When journalists asked whether he regretted his decision to abandon corporate leadership for community service, his answer was always the same. "I spent 30 years building an empire and lost my soul in the process." Grace Williams gave it back to me with 7 words on a piece of paper, and the courage to tell me the truth when nobody else would. His relationship with his teenage son Michael, once strained by Theodore's corporate obsessions and emotional unavailability, was rebuilt through their shared work in the community restaurants and Theodore's foundation programs. Michael, now planning to study business with a focus on social entrepreneurship, often worked alongside his father serving customers and learning that success could be measured in community impact rather than stock price performance. Their weekend conversations were no longer dominated by Theodore's work stress and corporate politics, but by stories of families they had helped and employees whose lives had been transformed through policies that treated human dignity as more important than quarterly earnings. Every year on March 10th, Grace and Theodore hosted a memorial service for the 12 employees whose deaths had sparked their transformation. The annual event had grown from a small church gathering to a national movement, with similar memorial services held in cities across the country to honor workers who had died from preventable causes related to corporate negligence and systematic exploitation. The services weren't just about remembering the dead. They were about recommitting to changes that would prevent future casualties and honoring the living family members who continued to be affected by losses that should never have occurred. Grace Williams and Theodore Blackwood had become unlikely partners in more than business. They had become friends united by their shared commitment to ensuring that no other family would experience the losses that had brought them together. Their friendship was built on mutual respect, shared values, and recognition that their different backgrounds and perspectives made them stronger advocates for worker rights and corporate responsibility than either could have been alone. Today, 3 years after Grace Williams placed that note beside a billionaire's coffee cup, the community restaurant movement continues to grow and evolve, creating models for business practices that prioritize human welfare alongside financial sustainability. Over 3,000 employees now work in community restaurants, earning living wages and comprehensive benefits while serving customers who appreciate food prepared by people who are treated with dignity and respect. 0 community restaurant employees have died from work-related stress or lack of healthcare access, a statistic that demonstrates how preventable the original 12 deaths actually were. 12 college scholarships are awarded annually in honor of the workers who lost their lives to operation efficiency, providing educational opportunities to young people from working-class families who might not otherwise have access to higher education. The scholarship recipients are chosen not just for academic achievement, but for demonstrated commitment to community service and social justice, ensuring that the values Grace Williams embodied continue to influence future generations of leaders and advocates. Could you write that note, knowing it might cost you your job and your family's financial security? Could you give up billions of dollars to do right by people you had failed? How many Grace Williams are working in your community right now, fighting battles nobody sees, caring for families while dealing with impossible circumstances, waiting for someone with power to listen and act on what they know is right? What choice will you make when you encounter injustice that you have the power to challenge or change? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they refuse to stay silent in the face of systematic injustice and corporate exploitation of vulnerable communities. Grace's grandson Marcus graduated from college debt-free, the first person in his family to earn a degree, and now works as a labor rights attorney specializing in cases involving corporate exploitation of vulnerable workers. His legal practice focuses on representing employees who face retaliation for speaking up about unsafe working conditions, insurance fraud, and systematic discrimination, continuing his grandmother's fight for worker dignity through the legal system and policy advocacy. Theodore's foundation has helped over 200 families facing medical bankruptcies, providing not just financial assistance, but comprehensive support services that address the root causes of healthcare-related financial crises. The foundation's approach goes beyond charity to advocacy, working to change insurance industry practices and corporate policies that create impossible choices between medical care and basic survival needs for working families across the country. As this story draws to a close, we return to the fundamental questions that make Grace Williams' courage so extraordinary and Theodore Blackwood's transformation so significant. What gives someone the strength to risk everything for what's right when speaking up could cost them everything they've worked to build? How do ordinary people find the courage to challenge systems that seem too powerful to change? What transforms a corporate executive who has lost his way into someone willing to sacrifice personal wealth for community welfare? Grace Williams says the answer to the first question is simple, though living by that answer requires extraordinary bravery. When you see people suffering and you have the power to speak up, staying silent becomes impossible. The risk isn't in speaking truth to power. It's in living with yourself if you don't. Her words reflect a moral clarity that cuts through all the complexity and rationalization that allows systematic exploitation to continue unchallenged by people who know better, but choose comfort over courage. Theodore Blackwood learned that true power isn't measured in stock prices, corporate holdings, or board positions, but in your ability to lift others up and create positive change in your community. Real success isn't what you accumulate for yourself, but what you contribute to the welfare of others, especially those who depend on your decisions for their survival and prosperity. His transformation demonstrates that it's never too late to remember who you used to be and choose to become someone better than who you've been. 7 words on a piece of paper changed 2 lives and sparked a movement that continues to grow and influence corporate practices across multiple industries. But perhaps the real lesson isn't about the courage required to write those words or the wisdom needed to listen to them and act on their implications. Perhaps it's about the choice we all face every day, to see other people as statistics in our success stories or as human beings deserving of dignity, respect, and the chance to thrive in communities that value their contributions. Grace Williams chose to see people as people, with families and dreams and struggles that mattered more than corporate efficiency metrics. Theodore Blackwood chose to remember the values his grandmother had taught him about treating business as an opportunity to serve others rather than exploit them for personal gain. Together they proved that it's never too late to choose compassion over profit, community welfare over individual wealth accumulation, and love over everything else that divides us or encourages us to treat each other as means to our own ends rather than as valuable human beings deserving of care and respect. Their story challenges every person who hears it to consider what they would do in similar circumstances.